The snow lay thick over St. Mary Mead, blanketing the village in a pristine hush. Icicles clung delicately to the eaves of the manor houses, and the occasional puff of smoke rose from chimney stacks, curling lazily into the pale winter sky. In such a serene setting, it was difficult to imagine that even the most genteel village could harbour secrets, and even more so a murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar armchair by a glowing fire, was knitting with a calm precision that belied the stirrings of curiosity that had long been her hallmark. The fire crackled merrily, casting flickering shadows across the sitting-room of her modest cottage. It was 3 days before Christmas, and the village was alight with preparations. Wreaths adorned every doorway, and the scent of baked goods wafted invitingly from Mrs. Price's bakery. Yet, even in the warmth of the season, human nature could never be entirely civilized, Miss Marple mused. Her peaceful reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. On opening it, she found Mr. Geoffrey Harding, a neighbour from the next lane, looking more perturbed than usual. Geoffrey was a tall man, thin, with a hawkish nose and eyes that seemed to dart nervously at every sound. "Miss Marple," he began, stepping in without waiting for an invitation, "I'm afraid something most dreadful has occurred at the Thornfield Manor. One cannot always rely on the police to uncover the truth in a small village. I thought you should know." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and studied him over the top of her knitting. "Dreadful, you say? Do sit down, Mr. Harding. It's the season for comfort, after all. Pray, tell me what has happened." Geoffrey sank into the chair opposite, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his coat. "It's Mr. Alexander Thorn, the master of Thornfield. He's been found dead in the library, by the fire." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "By the fire?" she echoed. "How? Theatrical?" "Yes," said Geoffrey, "though it is not clear whether it was an accident or something more sinister. The household staff are all aflutter, and Inspector Liddell from the County Constabulary has been notified, but, well, you understand how these things can be, slow in arriving." The thought of a suspicious death in Thornfield Manor was irresistible to Miss Marple. She set aside her knitting and poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to Geoffrey. "Tell me everything you know, from the beginning," she said. And Geoffrey did, recounting the discovery of the body by the maid, the peculiar positioning of the decanter of port beside Mr. Thorn, and the curious expression on the deceased's face, which had struck the maid as oddly serene. Miss Marple listened intently, nodding at intervals, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You say he was found by the fire. Was there anything unusual about the room?" "Well—" Geoffrey hesitated. The fire had been newly lit, and the stockings were disturbingly empty. "It's probably nothing, but Lady Thorn was fussing over them earlier. Also, the family and guests had been gathered in the drawing-room just before for carols. One cannot help but wonder how he ended up alone in the library." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That is the question, is it not? How did a man of habit find himself removed from the company of others in such a manner, and who had the opportunity to see to it that he remained alone?" The conversation continued long into the afternoon, as Geoffrey described the household. Lady Thorn, a woman of impeccable manners but sharp tongue. The sons, Edward and Charles, both promising yet argumentative young men. The daughter, Annabel, whose gentleness masked a mind as keen as any, and the staff each with loyalties, grievances, and the usual small resentments that simmer beneath the surface of polite society. Miss Marple could almost see the scene, a fire crackling in the grand library, shadows dancing along the ornate oak panelling, and Alexander Thorn seated, perhaps with a final sip of port, moments before. Something, and in this tableau each member of the household could have had both motive and opportunity. "Mr. Harding," Miss Marple said finally, "it appears you have provided me with a most intriguing puzzle. I shall pay Thornfield Manor a visit if you would be so kind as to accompany me. One never knows what small detail may unravel a mystery before it grows too tangled." As Geoffrey agreed, Miss Marple's mind was already working, reflecting upon the small peculiarities of human behaviour she had long observed in St. Mary Mead, a twitch of the eye, a hesitation in speech, the faint scent of perfume in a room, the pattern of one's shoes by the door. All these, she knew, could be telling. Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, and Thornfield Manor, with its steep roofs and frosted windows, loomed ahead like a cathedral of secrets, waiting to reveal the tragedy within. Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield Manor just as twilight cast its dusky veil over the countryside. The manor, grand and imposing, was festooned with holly and fairy lights, giving it an almost festive innocence that belied the tragedy inside. Lady Thorne greeted her in the drawing-room, her eyes red, rimmed from worry. "Miss Marple, how fortunate that you could come. I hardly know where to begin. The household is in chaos, and Inspector Liddell is overwhelmed, I fear. I am always happy to assist in any small way." Miss Marple replied politely. She began with careful observation, the arrangement of furniture, the open windows letting in a chill, the slightly smudged fireplace tools, and the scattered papers on Mr. Thorne's writing desk. She questioned each family member in turn, noting the slightest inconsistencies in their recollections. Edward claimed he had been practising the piano. Charles insisted he had been in the kitchen with the chef. Annabel had been helping Lady Thorne with the carol sheets. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to what they said, but how they said it. The servants were equally revealing. The maid, Miss Pritchard, fidgeted nervously, and the butler, Mr. Collins, seemed overly eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the family. Miss Marple quietly observed the household dynamics, noting the subtle tensions that had been hidden beneath the veneer of polite Christmas cheer. A second visit to the library allowed her to examine the scene more closely. The fire, freshly kindled, had left a faint residue on the hearth. The port decanter, tipped slightly, suggested a struggle, or perhaps an attempt to stage the scene. A book lay open, though the spine was uncreased, implying it had been placed rather than read. Miss Marple's attention lingered on the smallest details, a faint footprint near the window-sill, a chair slightly out of place, the absence of the usual ash in the fireplace. Each tiny clue was a thread that could lead to the truth. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a silvery frost that glittered across Thornfield Manor's lawns. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar shawl, took a quiet walk around the perimeter before entering again. There was something about the cold, crisp air that sharpened her mind, and indeed the chill seemed to make the hidden tensions within the household more visible. Inside, the family and staff were restless. Edward Thorne, the elder son, was pacing impatiently. "It's absurd," he muttered to himself. "Inspector Liddell should have deduced something by now." Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner of the drawing-room, noted his agitation. Young men often overestimate the efficacy of youthful energy. She remarked lightly, drawing his attention. Edward flushed, but could not argue with her gentle observation. She turned her attention to the servants. Miss Pritchard, the maid, had been unusually quiet during the morning's activities, yet when asked casually about her duties she hesitated, then admitted to having entered the library to tidy before breakfast, precisely around the time of the murder. A small detail, perhaps trivial to most, but not to Miss Marple. Then came a more startling twist, a second attempt at mystery. The housekeeper, Mrs. Watkins, discovered that a silver letter opener was missing from the sideboard in the library. This created a brief panic. Edward and Charles each denied moving it, Lady Thorne appeared distressed at the thought of any impropriety, and the maid seemed genuinely confused. Yet Miss Marple noted the careful avoidance of eye contact from one of the household staff, a subtle clue she filed away. Miss Marple also observed the interactions among the family, the thinly veiled rivalries between Edward and Charles, Lady Thorne's protective affection for Annabel, and an odd tension between Annabel and her father that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. Conversations were carefully polite but fraught with unspoken frustrations, a fertile ground for suspicion. During a quiet moment by the fire, Miss Marple reflected, one does not simply fall over by the hearth on a winter's evening. Accidents may happen, but there is always a human hand in cases that seem too perfectly timed. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had completed several discreet interviews, each yielding subtle contradictions. Charles had claimed to be on a telephone call to a business associate during the critical hour, yet the line showed no record. Annabel had been knitting in the drawing-room, but a faint smear of red port on her sleeve suggested she may have handled the decanter. Edward had expressed impatience with his father's frugality, hinting at a motive, while Lady Thorne's seemingly unflappable composure hid a sharp intellect and knowledge of her husband's affairs. Even the inspector, though capable, was prone to overlook small details, the slight misalignment of a chair, the faint scent of almond extract near the fireplace, the tiny footprint on the rug that suggested someone had entered the library through an unusual route. These were the subtle whispers of truth that Miss Marple had learned to listen for over decades. It was during her second evening in Thornfield that another clue surfaced. The cook, Mr. Harrison, brought a tray of mince pies, and, in passing, casually mentioned that Mr. Thorne had been unusually keen on keeping certain letters locked away in the study. Miss Marple inquired further and discovered a small, hidden compartment in the library's ornate desk. Inside were several letters hinting at financial dealings and blackmail, potential motives that reached beyond the walls of the manor. Miss Marple's mind worked like a loom, weaving threads together. The theft of the letter opener, the smudged port, the subtle animosities, all these points converged into a pattern, yet she knew better than to jump to conclusions. In her experience, a murder could be hidden behind layers of deception, each more artful than the last. That night she retired to her guest room with a notebook and jotted down her observations, thinking carefully over the day's developments. The manor seemed quiet, but she knew silence was often the companion of guilt. And she had begun to suspect that the simplest explanation, a tragic accident by the fire, was precisely what someone wanted her to believe. The following morning, Miss Marple requested a private audience with the family. They gathered reluctantly in the library, where the fire still glowed faintly. "I have been observing," Miss Marple began, her tone soft but commanding attention. "The interplay of human nature is rarely as simple as it appears. Often it is the smallest act, an omission, a gesture, a choice of words, that reveals the truth." She began systematically, recounting the inconsistencies she had noted: Edward's unverified alibi, Charles's telephone call that left no trace, Annabel's suspicious sleeve, Lady Thorne's knowledge of hidden letters, and the staff's small deceptions. The family listened in growing unease, exchanging furtive glances. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "the motive is not always what one expects. It is rarely money alone, though that may be a temptation. It is the matter of pride, of protecting appearances, of preserving what one holds dear, even if it leads to the most unfortunate consequences." A hush fell over the room. She walked slowly to the hearth and gestured toward the decanter of port. The positioning of this decanter, the residue on the hearth, the small footprint, Each detail tells a story, and when examined alongside the hidden letters, a picture emerges. Miss Marple paused, letting the tension mount. Mr. Alexander Thorne, a man of considerable exacting nature, was confronted by someone he trusted, someone who wished to prevent a discovery that would have brought shame or scandal. In the act of confrontation, the decanter was tipped. The fire was not the instrument of death, but a clever distraction, a scene to suggest an accident. Eyes widened, Lady Thorne gasped. Edward and Charles looked at each other nervously. Annabel's hand trembled slightly in her lap. The culprit, Miss Marple said gently, is Mr. Edward Thorne. Edward's face went pale. I don't understand," he stammered. Miss Marple continued, her voice measured. "You had discovered your father's letters concerning a financial arrangement that would have exposed debts he had incurred on your behalf. Fearful of disgrace, you confronted him in the library. The altercation became heated. In the struggle, he fell against the decanter. You attempted to make it appear accidental by placing him by the fire. Every other detail, the missing letter opener, your unconvincing alibi, was part of the ruse. Edward's protestations crumbled as the evidence, so meticulously observed by Miss Marple, was laid bare. The family's shock was tempered by relief that the mystery was finally explained. With Edward's guilt established, Miss Marple oversaw a careful reconstruction for Inspector Liddell, ensuring the truth was recorded without scandalizing the village. Edward was taken into custody, and the family, though shaken, began to recover. Lady Thorne, ever dignified, expressed gratitude to Miss Marple for her discretion and insight. The manor slowly returned to its seasonal rhythm. Annabel resumed her carol practice, Charles took on the orchestration of the village fete, and even the staff settled into their routines with renewed relief. Miss Marple, meanwhile, enjoyed quiet reflection by the fire in her own home, considering the lessons of human nature she had witnessed. "People are often more predictable than they think," she remarked to herself, knitting by the hearth. "Yet it is the small, almost imperceptible details that reveal the truth." And so Christmas came to St. Mary Mead, with snow still falling softly, wreaths in place, and the villagers carrying on as though life had never been interrupted. But in the hearts and minds of those who had experienced the events at Thornfield Manor, there lingered a quiet respect for Miss Marple, the woman who could see the truth in the most delicate of human gestures, and who could restore order not through force, but through observation, understanding, and an unfailing sense of justice. As the fire crackled and the last snowflakes settled on her window, Miss Marple reflected with a hint of her familiar wry smile. Even amid holiday cheer, human nature remained a puzzle, and she, as always, was content to watch, to listen, and to solve it.